I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Nick Maniatis, and I've got the Howling Fantods.
Well, awesome. Welcome, everybody, to this is episode 10 of The Great Concavity, and we, as an exciting guest, get to welcome on Nick Maniatis, who is the proprietor of the Howling Fantods website, which I would describe as kind of the hub for David Foster Wallace news, blog links, David Foster Wallace Amazon ads, and other things like that. So welcome to the show, Nick. Thank you so much for coming on, man. It's great to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here. It's awesome.
Nick is coming up, I got to say, on 19 years of running this website.
Wow, that's amazing, man.
It's a bit ridiculous, yeah.
That's almost as long as Infinite Jest has been out.
Well, yeah, pretty much. I probably should do something about that. I think every time an anniversary's passed, I've kind of realised 6 months later or something. I'm not so good at that stuff, but I'm just not. It's just always running in the background, and I just forget about it.
Let's get right into it, though. Let's have Nick give his intro and tell us how you first discovered David Foster Wallace in Australia, and what the background of the website is, all that stuff. We want to get into it.
Yeah.
All right. I have this fear of retelling stories, and you know that kind of the neurological thing of when you retell stories and you make changes, and then the changes become real in your memories. So when I start out, when I'm sometimes I'm loath to commit things to tape, as it were. But anyway, I know that when I was living at home with my parents, there was this huge national newspaper review of Infinite Jest with a big picture of Dave Foster Wallace, and I've never been able to track down exactly what newspaper that was. But I remember reading the review and thinking, whoa, completely interested in tracking down this book. And I think it wasn't until a few months later that I found it at the front of a bookshop, discounted, hardcover, one of the first editions with the Volman error on the back.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so in Australia. But I impulse bought it, and I think I was at the other side of Canberra, so I was catching a bus, public transport home, where I read those first sort of 20 pages or so.
Yeah.
And I haven't looked back. Really, I did stall in my first reading. I stalled around the 250, 300 page mark, and it took me a few months to pick it up again. I was, busy with uni and studies and all that kind of stuff. But
sure, yeah.
That's, that time around then, 1996, 97, was when the web was exploding and was everywhere. And at university, it was wonderful to kind of have that access and computer labs in the library and those kinds of things. And as a byproduct, I set up my GeoCities personal web page.
I remember this. I remember
it. And that was my first foray, I guess, into web stuff. And it was, these are my favorite books and these are my favorite musicians. And it was mostly links to, Yahoo's extensive index and animated Simpson GIFs and stuff. And that was kind of suddenly I recall starting Infinite Jest again, finishing it in a very short amount of time, and the last three or 400 pages in no time at all.
Just hard binging.
Yeah, that's right. And searching online, there wasn't much Wallace stuff. There was Bob Wake's collection of Infinite Jest reviews, and there was, I think it was Andrew Sandley, I think that's his name. I should have looked that up beforehand. He had a little Wallace website, and as I was when I was younger, I was hugely competitive, and I just wanted to, I guess I just wanted to collect everything that was Wallace related in the same spot. So it really was just a collection of links to start with. And then it very rapidly got out of control. Time spent at university was not spent studying, it was adding content and discovering Wallace L and jumping on there and lurking a lot.
Yeah.
And then it kind of got to that point that my site was bigger than all the others. And I'm
You'd
over
annex
here in
them
Australia.
all.
Yeah, and I'm here in Australia, on the other side of the world, to where all the excitement was. So it was kind of odd because I felt very isolated, and to a certain extent still do. but had, I think for the first time in my life, really had that aha moment with the internet, as you can meet like-minded people and track down all kinds of stuff, and it's just incredible.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
and I should say here, I discovered the website in 1997. Shortly after I started reading the book, I went looking for something related to the book and found it with Wallace L. and found it with Nick's website. And I feel like Nick and I have been through a lot together over the past 19 years. And I feel like, so Nick and I have met once and got to hang out in 2009 in New York at the Footnotes conference, which was amazing. But throughout all of this, I feel like there are very few people who I can truly relate to who have been through the sort of publicity scandals and all this crap that Nick and I have been through together. But like Nick and I are also about the same age, have kids about the same age. And so we have sort of grown up with this book together.
Yeah.
And really gone through this experience of becoming adults while, you know, being interested in the same things, which is rare because like Nick said, I felt isolated too for a while. And I felt like, you know, there's not that many people, even if I meet someone who's read the book, it's not the same as if I meet someone like Nick, who has been there since 1997. And we've been through a lot of the same trials and travails, and like it's hard to actually communicate what those periods of time were like.
Yeah, sounds like a real like Buildings Roman experience you guys have had.
a little bit like that. But I just want to reiterate like how important Nick is to the Wallace community is very important, because people even back in 1997 who before Google existed went looking for the website. I think I found his website on web crawler.
Yes.
It wasn't even on Yahoo. I was using web crawler at the time.
With that like spider logo.
I loved it. I loved web crawler and Alta Vista. And
Alta
Nick
Vista,
at the time, so Nick either somewhere around 1998 had message boards, Easy Board, and I loved the message boards. I was all about message boards back in the day, and also with Wallace L. This is around the time I joined the Wallace list in 1998 or so. And I was just in love because it was pure text, and you could pretend to be anyone, and that was it. There was no avatars, no nothing.
Those message boards, that is there's a hole in my heart and a pit in my stomach about that. Because you know, it was I was a student. I didn't have any money. I really couldn't afford to pay for any hosting, so Easy Boards were super popular, and there was some great stuff on those bulletin board things that we had running.
And there was a community of people.
There was a huge community. Was. And there was a huge hack that happened to the Easy Boards. And hundreds of boards had all of their content wiped. And I also realized I didn't really have the time to moderate. And I'm never a person that I can feel I can be monitoring 24/7. And there was a lot of moderation happening within the community on those boards. But that kind of set in my mind, with those gone, I'm not going to set that up and run that. If somebody else wants to do it, I'll link to it and say that it exists. But it was just soul destroying. I remember one of my favourite threads on there was a thread where somebody tried to track Don Gately versus the trials of Roman god. Or character, whatever.
Is it Hercules?
Hercules. Yeah, the trials of Hercules. Okay. And you know, it was one of those things of looking for textual evidence to support that, and it was one of those, there's so much more in Infinite Jest, maybe, than I even realised at that stage. There's some great stuff, and when that all disappeared, it was just horrible.
Well, and that's what I loved about it. It was people who immediately put down the book and went looking for someone to talk to.
Yes.
And Wallace L was very hard to figure out and join at the time. You know, we used a really tricky. You had to know like Unix commands to join Wallace L at the time, and so it was very hard to join. Whereas like the Easy Boards, you could just sort of click on and type your name, and I don't even think it saved your login info.
Maybe not. Maybe you could just title, and you could. I'm sure I'm the type of person that likes to set up if you can log in without having to supply a password and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, I remember people had all kinds of names on there, and it was just...
I remember having just such good debates about like what actually happened in like page references and tons of Infinite Jest conversations on there. And I remember the day you took it down, I was just completely crushed.
Well, it wasn't my choice.
No, I know you had no choice, and I mean it was a site-wide thing that affected every Easy board, but still, I just remember thinking like, wow, those conversations are gone forever, and like they still are. That's been like what 15 years ago.
There are some through archive.org that you can track down from the early ones, but it's not much. It's the first couple of months of it, I think, where it was sort of thin on the ground, not worthy enough, I think, to dredge through. Although, except for reminiscing, I guess.
I'm like, shit, that might be 17 years ago, Nick.
Yeah. Yeah, but, I mean, it's a lifetime. That's what it feels like to me. When you mentioned before growing up with Infinite Jest and this stuff, I reflect on that quite a bit these days, and particularly with Infinite Winter running, and that little post that I made, which was quite short, but it was quite fraught when I was writing that. Because there was a stage where I was so obsessed with Infinite Jest that it felt like a problem, and I really had to step back from it.
Quite funny.
Absolutely, and I have to admit that it took me a long time to realise that, and then suddenly when the switch popped on in my head, and I thought, hang on, maybe this is one of these things where I have to step back from it from a bit, which is what I did. I I was not reading widely. I was completely stuck in Infinite Jest, picking it up for, you had your comfort reads conversation a couple of episodes ago. Was that the end 2015 wrap up or something? And that I moved away from it intentionally. It was good.
That's fascinating.
I mean, for me, Nick, I relate to that very much, because there's been times where I remember 5-6 years ago where I wanted to step away from all of this crap, and really I just couldn't. I somehow couldn't, and it was like really baffling to me that I couldn't just do something else.
Yes,
like I could. Like I still had, like, it was so woven into my almost daily life that I've just sort of given up now. Like,
resigned yourself to this fate.
Yeah, I mean, this is just sort of like who I am. I think, like, I can't imagine not being involved in some way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, same. Absolutely. I mean, this podcast is awesome. The podcast that a teaching mate of mine runs and I host for him, 6 months ago I was saying, maybe I should do a Wallace podcast. But I also knew that my organisational habits to get something regular going are not so great. So it was pretty exciting to hear that you two had started this one, because I knew that
awesome.
that would give me the kind of stuff that I wanted to listen to. And I wouldn't have to do anything. Wouldn't have to have anything to do with it. So
I hope we didn't like snake your idea or something. We didn't know.
No way. After 2 episodes, it was quite clear you were going to way more depth than I was ever going to. So already the caliber of the guests and stuff has been wonderful. So.
Well, I appreciate that, Nick, and really, I have to give a lot of the credit to Dave there, because it was totally his idea, or maybe even his wife's idea.
Yeah, it was Rachel's idea.
But I gotta say, a lot of that wouldn't have happened. I don't think I would have met Dave if it were not for the Illinois State Conference. And there were, last year when Dave and I were talking about this in Illinois, there were a handful, at least a half dozen Australians there.
Yes.
Oh yeah. It's been a huge Australian community showing up to these things,
which was incredible. Like, I was blown away that there were so many people there from Australia.
Well, it's probably a good time to mention, and I know a few players behind the scenes know about it, but there is an Australian conference in the works.
Right.
We haven't.
It's Tony sort of putting that together.
Yeah, totally. And timing is the big issue right now. Australia being out of sync with the rest of the planet. Particularly in teaching times and all of that kind of thing. So I think right now it's a matter of trying to find the best time where we can get the best speakers out. And, with any conference kind of organisation thing, that when you get some good speakers and you lock them in, then it happens. And we're pretty convinced there'll be some people that will use it as an excuse to come and visit Australia, and that's not a bad thing at all. And
Well,
yeah,
the thing that amazes me about that is that how much I end up caring about that, the kind of community that those conferences produce, because everyone who's been to a Wallace conference, and now there's been a lot, like there's been like a dozen different Wallace conferences. Everyone who goes, they talk more about the community of people that they meet rather than about, I mean, the scholarship is definitely important and you learn a ton, but just the connections that you make with people. I mean, I'm still talking about the time when you and I met up and there was, Adam Kelly and David Herring and all the people who came over for the 2009 conference. And that's coming up on, that's over 6 years ago.
Yes.
And I think, wow, every one of the conferences that I've been to, like, I actually do care about these communities. In a way, I think, I should care more about, textual problems and be more highbrow. On the other hand, I think, like, no, I am who I am, and I really do care about, like, people who want to be part of these communities.
Yeah, totally. I feel like if I ever have to miss one of these conferences in the future, it's going to feel like being grounded by your parents, like in senior high, and all your friends are at the party and you're like stuck at home.
There's this, for me to get over to the US now is just so complicated with a young family and tricky, and taking time out from teaching and everything. It'd be nice to kind of have something on this side of the world for a little bit. That'd be lovely.
Yeah.
But I just have such fond memories of that Footnotes conference. Just incredible memories.
Are you guys planning for it to be in Melbourne?
Yes. I'm not sure exactly. Melbourne is the focus of where Tony is and where some other up and coming scholars are, which is pretty exciting. It looks like I'm trying to be a bit guarded about this, but it looks like we might be able to secure some funding for it, which is always something that's going to make something like that happen. And we've got a few pretty cool ideas about what we might run with. So yeah, I think the original focus was maybe at the end of this year, but that the timing might be tight for that. That might blow out to next year. I'm not sure yet, but when we know for sure, you'll hear more, definitely.
I'll do everything I can to make it down. Maybe I can meet John Safran while I'm there.
Oh, so when you mentioned that book, I love that book. It was funny when you were talking about John Safran. Yeah, and you went back to talking about Music Jamboree. Did you manage to see any of his skits from the TV show Race Around the World?
Just sort of the stuff that he had on that and
on
other
the DVD.
shows, but nothing too far beyond that. No.
Yeah, so on ABC television, I think many years ago, there was a show where they got 6 young up and coming media students or people interested, and they sent them around the world. They had to put in a documentary every week, the audience, and they had panel of judges and that kind of thing. And I don't think John Safran won when he was in it, but he was the audience choice for just doing crazy
for being
things all over
absolutely
the world.
bananas.
Absolutely.
He's a wild.
Yeah.
Matt, have you seen anything by John Safran? You got to check this guy out. He's so funny.
I think you sent me a link, Dave. We'll have to put one on our website so other people can enjoy this as well.
I want his stuff to get further out into the world, because it doesn't seem like a lot of people outside of Australia know much about him too often.
That's right.
But I try and spread the word as much as I can.
Well, he's notorious for performing stunts that create huge problems as well.
Yeah, legal problems.
Yeah. But one of the interesting things that used to be on YouTube was a failed pilot for a cooking show. And it starts off like a cooking show, making, maybe it was burger patties or something, I'm not sure. And it's like, you need this ingredient, now you need some beef. And then it cuts and he's in an abattoir, and they sort of show them putting the bolt through the cow's head and then, slicing it up. And so it's that kind of, this is where your food comes from. We're showing you a cooking show. We're going right back to the roots. I think its pilot didn't get picked up for obvious reasons. It's not really mainstream television.
A little too visceral.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, like the scene in John Safran versus God where he goes to the Haitian voodoo ceremony.
Yes.
And he's involved with like a killing of a goat that's very graphic and involves its testicles, and Yeah, it's intense.
And on his you mentioned John Safran versus God as well on the other podcast, the one where he experiences the religions thing. Was that the same one?
Yeah,
that's the same one, isn't it? And when the possession episode, he and goes through an exorcism. He ran. I think they've just finished up here. It had a radio show on Sunday nights called that was him and with Father Bob. Yep, a priest down in Melbourne.
Bob McGuire, Triple J.
Bob McGuire, yep, on Triple J. And that was something that I didn't listen to on Sunday nights. I download the podcast and listen when riding to work. And he's obsessed with possession and exorcism stuff.
Yeah, sure is.
And he's an odd.
Well, we'll have to check that out later. Anyways, what I was saying about Infinite Winter, the Infinite Winter thing, I've been really surprised about how maybe it's the 20th anniversary, maybe it's the enthusiasm of Mark Flanagan, who is the coordinator of Infinite Winter, but there have been a lot of other attempts to have big rereads. And I mean, Nick and I was thinking we've been involved in at least half a dozen of other attempts that haven't really gotten off the ground as well as this one has.
That's right.
Dave, you're one of the guides. Why do you think this one is being so successful right now?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do probably with, as you said, Mark has just been an amazing advocate for it, and the social media presence and support has been pretty outstanding. I'm just seeing it everywhere on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram. So I think also too, the way that Mark has reached out to members of the Wallace community, that people who have done artistic projects like Corey and Nathan, and then asking us doing the podcast. I think that has probably helped somewhat with sort of those people are all active, and then so they're all tweeting things out and Instagramming things, and so it's just kind of the tentacles have gone out, and I think Mark's done a really awesome job of that, really enthusiastic job. So I think that's probably part of it. I also think too the name probably helps. A lot of people were familiar with Infinite Summer, and so just going with another season and saying Infinite Winter probably sort of sparks that for people, that association. So that's worked really well. I think he's just done a great job setting it up, and he's got, and the range of people doing those blog posts weekly and introducing. It's such a diverse range of people, so that it's not just kind of limited to that complete textual approach. Because of all the different things that people are bringing to it, I'm enjoying following. I always do. All the reads. I lurk more often than not these days. But it's that way to experience a first reading again. When you get somebody who's reading for the first time and their excitement and making the connections, and it's just wonderful. Yeah,
once again, stopping you from finding something else.
Reimagining. Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is that all those people, all the guides, have at least been to one of the DFW conferences in Illinois. So it's actually people who have met at some point. And I think that's what does it, is that there's a level of enthusiasm that Illinois State has been able to provide. And I really hope that they're able to keep that going. The third annual conference is coming up this year.
Yes.
And unfortunately, they moved it to the middle of summer. It was in May the past 2 years, and they moved it to the weekend, which I'm not going to be able to attend. So I'm already really sad about not being able to attend that, because every year I feel like I've met just a ton of incredible people who end up doing all of these interesting things.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined that. Well, let's say 5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined that there would actually be an ongoing annual conference in one place. So I think that's actually been a huge deal.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Having that permanent calendar spot, knowing that every year there is somewhere for people to share ideas and bounce ideas in their upcoming work and what have you off each other is pretty exciting. For all manner of reasons, and all the creative stuff coming out of it as well is really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's, like I say, it's given birth to all these other things. Infinite Winter, I think, has also been helped by the fact of this 20th anniversary coming up. And I got to say, I was looking at the calendar today thinking, no one yet has posted a picture of this 20th anniversary edition. And I'm sort of surprised, a galley of it hasn't leaked. Or, I want to see a picture of this book. And, with Nick and I, so Nick and I occasionally back Little Brown used to have a different director of publicity
Yes.
who was great, named Marlena Bittner, and she was great. And occasionally she would send us David Foster Wallace books
Yep.
to review in advance, but she left and she took a new job. And so it's always a crapshoot for me of like, are they going to send me a new one? Or am I going to need to buy it so I get it, first right offhand? So
Yeah.
I just went ahead and pre-ordered this thing, and I'm like, I'm checking the status of it like every day right now to see, am I going to get this new cover? Even though I'm not a huge fan of the cover, I think they could have done a little bit better. I still, I need it. I really need it.
Yeah, dear publishers listening to this podcast, you can feel free to send us free David Foster Wallace books and materials whenever you like, and we'll talk about them on the show.
Hey, we have a lot of listeners. Nick has a ton of hits.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are the folks, right? And so we should be getting this stuff, but like it's a crapshoot. Like some years we don't, some years we do, some years we don't. So I'm like, I cannot live without this. So I mean, maybe they know that, and they're like, hey, 2 extra sales by not sending me free copy.
Well, I think I've got I think Claire Hayes Brady's books on the way to me from somewhere. I can't wait to get my hands on that. I'm so excited.
The Bloomsbury book.
Yeah.
No, she's a fantastic writer, and really Bloomsbury has become a sort of de facto like Wallace Studies publisher.
Yes, they have.
And now they have published at least a half dozen or more Wallace Studies books, and more forthcoming. Almost every big one that gets snapped up is forthcoming from Bloomsbury. David Herring's book, I know, they're coming out in September. I can't wait to get a review copy of that book, and that's going to be fantastic because it really just looks at, the fiction, and it doesn't mess around with a lot of other parts. It gets to sort of a lot of core problems. Like when that book comes out is Bloomsbury, Claire Hayes Brady, Bloomsbury.
Yes.
Marshall Boswell had a book called the Long David Foster Wallace and the
Long Thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good collection, that one as well.
That was a fantastic.
Yeah.
Another one I'm really looking forward to, since we're on this topic now, is Columbia University Press, my former employer, who I love. I loved working there, honestly. They're a great company. And they have sort of become a David Foster Wallace publisher by publishing that Fate, Time, and Language book.
Yes.
And then the Freedom and the Self book last year. And then this year, they have the Jeffrey Seavers book coming out. Right. So Jeff Seavers has a book on Wallace coming out, which looks really good. I think he's one of the better young scholars out there working on David Foster Wallace stuff. And like I say, there are also a handful of those in Australia too that I know have books in the works. Lucas Thompson, I've got to meet several times. Yeah. I don't know if you've met him, but like fantastic Wallace scholar from Australia. So I'm really excited about this is, I feel like it's somehow just now ramping up at the 20th anniversary. It's crazy.
I love reading the critical stuff. I always have, and it kind of gives me teaching high school. I don't always get to the those literary peaks that maybe I find totally rewarding, but that's okay. I love working with teenagers. But when these books arrive, I love just sitting there and devouring them. The Freedom in the Self collection. There are a couple of really interesting pieces in there. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I often read them on car trips between here and the South Coast.
There's one about happiness, and I remember one about the hedgehog.
Yes.
Hedgehog.
Yeah. So there's a lot out there. If you get into Wallace and you're interested in the critical side, there's so much.
Yeah, it is blowing up lately.
Well, and like I say, what's amazing to me is that there was a time where you could keep up with this, and Nick and I could feel like, oh, we've read everything, and now I feel like I'm so far behind. Like there's no way I can catch up.
Same.
Yeah.
And there's just an incredible amount of stuff coming out every year, new papers. I mean, it used to be a big deal when there was like one big critical paper that was published. But now that's a regular occurrence. And I mean, Jeff Seavers has a ton of papers that have been published in academic journals that just really haven't been digested by even the larger Wallace Studies crowd, because there's so many other people writing papers every year, every conference. There's just tons of papers.
It's like information glut almost.
So the biggest criticism of my website from myself is that I don't personally have the time to track everything like I used to, but part of it is because of how much is appearing. And when Matt said one paper would appear and everyone would read it, there's all of this stuff on the website that's so out of date. I don't want to delete because for some of it they're sort of the only point. That's the only place that points to some of them. But it's certainly not organised in any kind of logical format except for chronological. And I've had a couple of hiccups with the site and things that have just when I've been in a flurry of excitement of getting things done. When there's kind of a setback, you're worried about losing everything, like the time I lost the website.
Tell
Do you remember
us about
that?
Yeah, tell us about that.
I think it was 4 or 5 years ago now, probably 5 years ago. I was hosting, when I moved from GeoCities, so that wonderful Athens Acropolis address, which I picked because of my surname. That's completely the Greek history in the family.
I love that.
And eventually found out I could afford a domain name and needed a host. One of my previous hobbies was brick filming and making animations out of Lego and what have you, amateur little stop motion animation things. And the guy that took over the Brick Films website, this great guy Josh, I think was his name. He also, in order to maintain the Brick Film stuff, he offered hosting packages so people could run their own websites, which was great. That was the backbone of the Howling Fantods for years until he sold the site to someone else. And when that all went through, eventually they just cut off the hosting to all of these other people that were paying for hosting without letting any of us know.
Rad.
So one day I got a flurry of emails from people saying the Howling Fantods is gone. And that was the first time I found out. And I remember frantically trying to get in touch with the people who now own the whole thing, and they said, "Oh no, we've just turned it all off." So for a few days I was using archive.org and everything because that's pretty up to date. Of just ripping everything, all the content and everything into text files to save that while I was negotiating with them. And really it got to the point where they said, "Oh look, we'll turn your server back on so you can access your stuff, but you'll have to pay us."
Oh my gosh!
And it wasn't hundreds of dollars. It was an affordable amount. And for me, I was so angry at that point. It's like, well, if I can pay some money and get my stuff back, I did, and I didn't lose a thing. But there was a time period there I was doing community service announcements at staff meetings. Say, hey, that where we remind you to back up things. My last backup from my website was 3 months ago. I might have lost all of this other stuff. I learned a lot about backing up from that. Wouldn't be surprised.
My memory of that, Nick, is that it took like a month.
Yeah,
like a month?
It wasn't. It was. I think it was only about 2 weeks.
Okay.
But when at that point I was updating super regularly, so to suddenly not have new things popping up 3 times a week, I was scared of it disappearing forever and losing momentum at a time where the page had lots of momentum. So now I'm not so worried about that stuff. I just, I use Twitter a lot and Facebook, and I update when I have time and the big things. I can't track every little thing now. It's just impossible. And that's what I use Twitter for mostly. That's try and retweet and get everything out there. So, but, I think
the same here. I mean, I was wondering if the Wallace L listserv too is really, it's been sort of taken over by social media.
Yes.
And a lot of the stuff, it used to be every time we had a link, we would put it on the listserv. And now I just put it all on Twitter or on Facebook. And I probably have more Twitter followers than I do members of Wallace L, although it's not a perfect overlap, right? So I don't know that Wallace L will ever go away. And, I haven't told the story on the podcast yet, but Wallace L is a spinoff of Pension L.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you said that in the first episode.
Well, Pension L was really started by a bunch of, I would say the website was taken over and hosted by a bunch of sort of vegan anarchists from Minneapolis.
From Minneapolis. Oh.
And they were also very into Burning Man.
Oh, yeah, of course. You'd have to be.
And they have never asked for a dime from me. And they have, in the spirit of true, because, if you go to Burning Man, they don't spend money. You cannot spend money there.
Oh, really?
Right. Everything is done with just like this
Is there like
spirit of
beads
giving
for currency?
No, there's no currency. Everything is given with like the spirit of love and giving. Right. So you don't charge anyone for anything. And Wallace L is coming up in April on its 20th anniversary. Now wow. I took over from the original guy who set it up, Dan Schmidt. Dan is still on Twitter, Dan_Schmidt. You should follow him. Super interesting dude. He passed the reins to me. It's coming up on 14 years now.
Wow.
So 14 years. And I gotta say, in that time, we have seen a lot of changes, not only in Wallace's life, but in technology. And I feel like the whole thing is still evolving. And Wallace studies in general have come a long ways, and yet they are still not as codified as some other big writers. Right. So I was gonna ask Nick or Dave, either one of you, if you are. I mean, to me, I'm not as involved in like any other writer societies, but I know there are other big, like established societies. Do you have any experience with that?
None at all. Not at all.
Yeah, me neither.
Me neither. I mean, I know like in the U.S., like Faulkner, like they have a big conference every year, and you can go and like see where he wrote, and it's a big part of the University of Mississippi. It's like formally. And now, like, there's a statue of him, right? Like an actual statue. And Wallace, I mean, the closest thing we have is this conference at ISU, which is really not a central part of the university at all. Like, it's still very much on the fringes.
Right.
And Wallace is still very young. He's the youngest to ever be acquired by the Ransom Center by only a few years now. But still feels like there's a lot more to come, like Nick, what do you predict is going to happen in our lifetimes? Like, what are we going to see a Wallace statue or institute or
no,
museum?
A diaper on the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, dearie me. As a side there, my dearie me, I'm so conscious of my Australian swearing. There's been a couple of times where I've really just held back. I don't know. Twitter amazed me. I avoided Twitter for a long time because I was one of those why is it interesting to tweet what you're buying at the shops and stuff. And I remember I realized that Matt, there was so much stuff that you were tweeting, and I was kind of following that by the side. And I remember I joined up as an experiment, and suddenly my brain exploded. I mean, with technology stuff, it's very difficult to predict. It's very difficult, and that's not even something I feel comfortable doing, except for the fact of how much of Infinite Jest seems to have pointed into the future and had some surprising parallels about consumption of entertainment, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know about either one of you guys, and like, if I admit it, like I probably am addicted to technology in some way.
Yep,
like
completely.
It's very difficult for me to even, I read about these people who go on like, a retreat and don't take any electronics, and they're gone for like 2 weeks, and I'm like, that sounds like hell to me.
Yes, I agree. Completely does.
I mean, for me, like I'm not proud of it, but I'm on my phone or a computer like most of the waking time I'm alive now, and I sort of feel like that's become the modern condition.
I agree. For me, I find it so helpful because if there's something that I know I don't need to remember and I can find somewhere, I don't bother remembering it, and that doesn't even bother me. I just think it gives me great headspace. I've got room for other things now. But the other thing as well is that, I mean, this podcast here typifies that kind of thing, in that we've got this community that's spread all around the world, and now we're talking like we spend every day together. And that, Matt, you mentioned in conference stuff before, I remember flying back to Australia being completely shattered that I might not see these people again soon. And yet all of the online stuff has kept a lot of those friendships and relationships going to some extent anyway.
No, I agree. When Wallace says, like, the purpose of literature is to make you feel less alone.
Yeah.
And, I used to feel like, oh, well, how can you really relate? How can a book replace a person? But for me, it really has. And, I really feel like I have as good of friends online through literature, or that I've met through literature, than I do in real life. And part of that is the transitory nature of real life versus the sort of static nature of, that's sort of what we've been talking about, of this book has been there for me for 20 years. And Nick and I have known each other probably 18 years.
Yes.
And I mean, that's longer than I know, most of my friends from university. So.
Absolutely. So I just thought of a question, because to hark back to something we were talking about before. Matt, we've grown up with Infinite Jest.
Yeah.
I really feel that I have become an adult reading Infinite Jest. What changes have you noticed in reading it as you've got older? Have you got anything new out of it, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, for me, I was very fond of and related to Howling Candenza right off the bat, and I felt like here's a sad, misunderstood,
lexical prodigy.
Yeah, young man, and that is my guy. And then now I feel like the real struggle is about Don Gately, and it's a really, what I'm writing about with my friend Rob right now on my Simple Ranger site is really about AA. And I think that's something that didn't make sense to me when I'm 22 and I'm just going out and we'll have a few beers and whatever, you wake up the next day and you're fine.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself surrounded by 40-year-old people who are basically all functional alcoholics. And you think damn, something has really changed in my life, and that it's not so much, it's about making it, through this week and through next year and through, the fun of all of that is gone. So, I mean, to me, I relate a lot more to the AA sections, even though I'm not in AA. I don't relate to AA at all, but the stuff that Wallace identified with there, to me, I mean, that's starting to make a lot more sense to me right now. I gotta say, I'm very interested in why that appealed to Wallace right now.
Yeah. I completely agree with you there. There's a lot aging and thinking about, I guess, habits you get into and that kind of stuff. That Infinite Jest still makes me question some of those things in a very good way. I'm thinking back to when I emailed a few people from Wallace right after my mum died, and I was kind of fishing for quotes that I could read out at her funeral, just wondering for suggestions. I mean, that's the level of my obsession. What I wanted to do was read Wallace at my mum's funeral, and I ended up quoting from the Marathon Steeply section about choosing to love. And there's a big part of that with mum dying and me not being particularly close to her, and making an active public choice to read a section about choosing to have a certain relationship with a person and making that decision to, rather than having love as automatic because they're family members or what have you. That hugely resonated at the time, and every time I read those sections in the book, I think about that contradiction and those different types of love that exist. That's absolutely fascinating to me. And on my first second read, I know I tried to rush through the Marath Steeply stuff. I feel like I was so young that I didn't really get it. There were some good jokes in there, maybe over the top bits, but and as I got older, that stuff became wonderful.
Yeah.
No, I agree 100%. And what I was thinking about today, Nick, is how much you and I read that book, pre-2005 or 2006, and really just focused on a lot of textual stuff. And then after Wallace died and it came out, that he had been a depressive and he had lived in a halfway house, and we had this Grenada House sort of testimonial.
Yes.
And it totally changed the reading of the book for me now. And now I see it almost as a completely autobiographical book. And it's very hard for me to not read it and think, what was Wallace thinking at the time? Which honestly, I didn't think of at all when I first read it.
Completely agree with you. I didn't think that at all either. I read it as Infinite Jest, this story, and I'm so grateful that I did get to read it like that. because it does cast such a cloud over a reading of it, and it's very difficult to move beyond that when you're reading any section. I mean, the Kate Gompert section in the hospital with the interview with, with that young
it's
doctor.
just brutal.
That's right.
I was rereading it this week, and there was a part where Pat Montesian is sitting in her office, and this sort of conversations overheard of people going in and out of her office, and a guy walks in and just says, "I'm wondering if there's any program prayer for when you feel like hanging yourself."
Yes.
And I was like, "Oh,
yes.
Jesus!" Like, just took the breath out of me, thinking like, I can't imagine him thinking about this from 1994 or whenever he wrote this on. And at the time I wouldn't have even thought twice about it, just thinking, oh, he's got some great material in here about addicts. Because I was honestly, he was very cagey and straight up lied about a lot of his, it's an anonymous program, right? So you're not supposed to admit you're in it.
Yes.
So he straight up lied and was very cagey about. He just sat in on some of these meetings, and it was very easy to distance yourself as a work of literature, and to say, it's just literature. But for me, it's been too affecting almost to reread it entirely.
That's one of the reasons I dip in and dip out, I think, and I'm ahead of the game on Infinite Winter right now because I'm currently reading it, so I'm sort of just following along right now, seeing where people are up to and that kind of stuff. One of the things, I didn't know if I was going to mention it, but I'm going to mention it because I feel comfortable doing so, is that some of the psychology kind of seeing someone, trying to get someone to help with your problems and that kind of stuff, and from the parody of the professional conversationalist to some of the help stuff that Hal goes to at the end with the inner teddy bear and that kind of stuff. Inner infants, that kind of stuff. We had a bit of a tragedy at our high school and lost a student, and the end result was, for me, I ended up going to see people through work to deal with that. I'd never experienced anything like that before, but I found that when I was in the process of talking to professionals about helping me and my mental state, that I had that meta conversation in my head about the conversation we were having, and it felt like sequences of Infinite Jest or some of the short stories of the depressed person where I'm playing a game with myself and the person I'm talking to, and I found it absolutely fascinating, to the point then I would bring up David Foster Wallace and say that this is the stuff I read and I'm fascinated by, and I'm playing a game with you while I'm talking to, that kind of thing. And it helped. It actually really helped, which was the surprising part. I found it very comforting that it, once again, the cliche that everyone mentions, that it feels like reading Wallace is like the voice in your head. Even though we're all different people, there's just there's some point that he touches upon that makes these things real and helpful and accessible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I've thought a lot about that too, about how, what he must have gone through to get to this point to write the book.
Yes.
And that's not something that I really paid much attention to. And, this brings up a lot of complicated issues about sort of how much do you play into the intentional fallacy, how much do you regard the authorial voice at all. But to me, they're almost inextricable with Wallace, because he died so young, and we have his biography, and we know sort of what he went through to write these books. So it's very hard for me to look at that book and say, what was his AA story like? What was he able to get through from his childhood, to get to the point where he says, I'm going to live in a halfway house.
Yeah.
So that's been very, that's changed the reading of the book for me. And at least kept me, interested as an adult, because I see myself now at about the age. And, I've also thought about someday I'm going to pass the age. Like, I turned 40 this year. I'm going to pass the age when Wallace died.
Yes.
And, that's a sort of milestone for me, because he talks about it in the This Is Water speech, right? He says, about maybe making it till 50. And he didn't. But he brought that up. And so I sort of think, I've got some milestones in my life, outliving my grandfather, outliving Wallace, seeing my kids have their own kids. You know, there's a lot of milestones you have in your life, but like that's one of mine, and I'm not sure why. He's had such a big impact on our lives, but it's definitely changed the way. Like, there's no other book for me that compares this way, right? Like I've read a ton of other books, and there's none to me. Like, I could name other writers who have committed suicide. I could name other writers who died young.
Yes.
And I've 20 years on, I haven't been able to find anything that's really compared it to me. You know, at this sort of visceral, personal level.
Yeah.
It's Wallace tattoos.
Yeah.
Do you have one, Nick?
I do. And that's a new thing.
I didn't know that. I haven't.
What is it?
Told anyone in the Wallace community about it. It got sparked by the that wonderful article by Casey Henry, the one that I posted about recently about the annular circles in Infinite Jest.
Yes, I remember it. Yeah.
And the partially occluded circle and that kind of stuff. So I copied. That's terrible. Once again, I can't remember the guy that also has one. He's got one on his wrist, one of the circles. And
I've seen that on Google.
Peter Knox.
Yeah, that's it, Peter Knox. So I pretty much copy Peter. But
Yeah.
I've wanted a tattoo for a long time, but just wanted to make sure it was something that I was comfortable with. And then, so Peter Knox ones has been sitting there for a while, but when this article came out, it made me realise just how important Infinite Jest is to my life. And there's part of me that feels a bit like I'm tattooing myself with, you know, bit of conflict initially about it, but it just means so much to me. I can't believe I got it done.
That's huge. I love it. I love it.
And it's like just on the inside of my left arm above the elbow, so I can see it a lot, but it's not really public. So it's there for me as well. So yeah, a friend and I went out and got tattoos together, which was nice, and that's part. You know, one thing, I've turned 40 as well, so I was like, I want to do something a bit different. That'll age well, because it's been 40 years before I got my first one. But I've got the bug, I tell you. I enjoyed the experience a lot, way more than I expected.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's funny, you guys talking about this concept of Infinite Jest becoming so much a part of identity. And I made kind of a controversial statement in my intro post last week for Infinite Winter, where I said that, you know, I'm not sure if someone who hasn't read this book can fully understand me. And that was particularly controversial because my wife, Rachel, she hasn't read the book in entirety yet. So she proofread it, and she kind of looked at me after, and she's like, so this sentence is pretty interesting. And I was like, yeah, I know. So we had like a long talk about it, and it was fascinating. But she's reading it now, part of Infinite Winter, and her mom is, and I think her sister is too. So, but I hear what you guys are saying about that idea that this book does something weird psychologically, where it becomes so entrenched in who you are and the way that you see the world and think about things, that there really is, you know, you can share a lot with other readers of this book that maybe you can't with people who haven't experienced it.
Completely.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Janie hasn't made it through. My partner hasn't made it through Infinite Jest, and I don't think she ever will. But she's read all the short fiction, all the essays, and loves them. Really likes them.
Yeah, Rachel's read some of that stuff too.
Yeah, so she sees where I'm coming from and sees the obsession there. But in the last year, the real excitement for me is that my brother finished Infinite Jest, and from everything that I've spoken to him about, he really enjoyed it. And another friend of mine picked up Infinite Jest and is currently reading Infinite Jest. And once again, it's that thing that I agree with you that it has become so such a part of my personality. It has that when I know people have read it, then I do feel like they understand more about me and where I'm coming from. That's pretty. On the one hand, it's pretty big. On the other side, it's kind of scary, obsessive stuff. That's
sure, yeah. It could go both ways.
Yeah,
well, everyone has their thing, though, right? Like, I think, you know, my wife, when I was courting her, I tried to get her to read it. I pulled out these different sections. I was like, just start here. Don't even start at the beginning. Just read this section. And she was like, what are you doing? I'm not going to read this. but she's accepted. I mean, on the other flip side of that, I have not run a marathon, and that's something really important to her. So like people who have run marathons, they sort of have this bond, or people who have, I don't know, skydived, or people who have gone through the Grand Canyon, like they have a bond. And
or people who play Netrunner.
There you go, Android Netrunner. Like you have a bond, and like I have a bond with people who have really not just read Infinite Jest once, but like with me, that's what I was trying to relate to with Nick earlier. Is like Nick and I would go way back. Like forget reading it once, we've read it once 20 years ago.
Yes.
And it's sort of like we've been through war since then. And we're literally, we've been in the shit. Like literally the guy we looked up to killed himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was I'm still not over it.
And the guy that wrote so much about how to survive the darkest times in your life didn't make it. And I know that there are people who are detractors and say, see, that's why you shouldn't trust his stuff. But for me, it's quite the opposite. Right. He was able to share that, and he was in the midst of it, and we never knew.
Absolutely. And, I never blamed him for a second. No. I never felt bad about it. And like I say, I had some personal interactions with Wallace where he was not kind to me.
Right.
And I apologized. I apologized on his behalf. I was like, he doesn't really like social interactions. He doesn't really, I felt like there was nothing that he could have done because he wrote these books, there was nothing he could have done to alienate me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And see, I never reached out to contact him. Never. Early on, I was thinking about it, but then when it became very clear with conversations with people around the scene that, if I wrote to him, he would definitely write back because he had to.
He did it for everyone.
Yeah, for everyone. And I didn't want to put him in that position. And also because the Howling Fantods, for a very long time, and I still try to avoid it, I try to make it about the writing and not him. That's very difficult these days. And so it kind of felt like I knew he knew the website existed and that he wasn't totally comfortable with it. And so I didn't want to push boundaries, I guess. And I'm sad I never did, but I'm glad I never did. It's a very, it's an odd position.
Well, and honestly, I've never written a fan letter to a writer, period. And because I do feel like what you're saying, it distracts them from what they're doing, their work. And I do, a couple of years ago, I discovered though, Nick, that, I shared this with you, that there was printouts of your website from like 1998 in the Ransom Center.
Oh, cool.
And that Wallace's agent, Bonnie Nadell, had printed them out and faxed them to Michael Peach at Little Brown. Maybe this was 2000.
Yeah.
This was after I think Brief Interviews had come out, and you had a banner ad up there or something, and she had faxed them, just been like, this is crazy, like be aware of this. And just because it was so rare at the time to have a fan who cared so much to actually create a literary fiction website, like a fan site, it was unheard of.
Which brings me to, I'm mindful of time here, but the Howling Fantods, I first named the site, and I've written about it, the Screaming Fantods, because I totally misremembered the phrase when so I don't know if somebody contacted me via email or through the website comments or something like, Nick, it's the Howling Fantods. I feel like such an idiot. But for me, that phrase embodies that there's a real feeling there, and when you're there, it's kind of terrifying. And when the Wallace community, when fans started calling themselves Fantods, my brain once again did this snap. For me, I never conceived of the idea that Wallace fan and Fantods was the link. It was just I wanted a name for the site that was synonymous with the depth of emotion that Infinite Jest, and some real, and then that was kind of out of my control. And I've always found it kind of amusing and annoying. Because I probably would have titled it something else if I'd realised the word, like the fan was in there.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it's so.
I think you picked like the best phrase from Infinite Jest for it, and I think like when we were trying to think of a name for this podcast, I was like, I wish the Howling Fantods wasn't already established, because that would be great.
Well, hey Nick, I know it's getting past an hour now.
Yep.
I just want to say, thank you for coming on the show. It's been so good talking to you. I hope that we can hang out again soon. It's been too long, brother.
It has been. It's been too long. I have one thing to say before we go, and that is when comfort reading stuff. I found that a really cool question. My comfort reading
Chris
is
Ayres.
trashy horror. So, so as a kid, I read it, everything by Stephen King. Haven't in years, but my real love was Clive Barker, and to be honest, probably still is. I've got all these books on my Kindle, and that's what I flick to when I'm tired. But when I read Wallace's review of The Great and Secret Show, which for a while was one of my very favourite books,
I loved that book.
I loved it, but I felt broken after reading his review because
you just rip it apart.
It's quite and to be honest, I think he's quite spot on. But there was this time where I was so embarrassed that I loved Clive Barker because Wallace so disliked The Great and Secret Show. But that's kind of the path that I go down. And The Leftovers, love it so much. TV show The Leftovers.
Oh yeah,
just incredible television. A show I would never expect that I would have loved. Yeah.
It's been so great talking to you, Nick.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
Nick. I really enjoyed it, man. We should just get on Skype some other time and have a chat.
Totally.
That'd be good. Thanks, guys, for having me on the show.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome, Nick. Thanks again for coming on. Thanks so much for the work you do with the website as well, man. It's been such a hub for the community for so long, and keep up the great work, man. If people want to get in touch with you, Nick, through social media or other ways, where can they do that?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at Nick_Maniatis. Of course, they can hit me up at thehowlingfantods.com/DFW. But the other thing that I kind of run in the background as well, I host a podcast by my mate Matt called The Chattering Classes, and that is about hour-long interviews with essentially our friendship group, but a lot of teachers, a lot of people involved in education, and a number of ex-students who are now adults. So talking to ex-students about what they remember of you when you taught them is it's super interesting. So I'll make sure that you get the link to that as well. So if people are keen on hearing some personal conversation stuff, they can.
That's awesome. Maybe also you can send us a picture of your tattoo.
Oh yeah, okay.
We can put that as we can tweet that out as the podcast.
Yeah.
Image on Twitter or whatever. If you want. That's cool too. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Nick. It's been rad talking to you, man.
Cheers.
As usual, housekeeping things. Robin O'Neill has done our podcast icon, so thanks, Robin. Thanks to the band Parquet Courts for their song Instant Disassembly. And if you want to get in touch with us, Matt, where can people find us?
Well, before I say that, one last thing. I got to give a shout out to our listener, Sam, who I ran into last week at the at the Harry Ransom Center for the 20th anniversary celebration of Infinite Jest. I want to say hello, Sam. I want to say if you can email us, it's at concavityshow@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at concavityshow. And we're on Instagram, I think, also at Concavity Show. Is that right, Dave?
Yeah, that's right.
Didn't you say it was Convexity Show, Dave?
No. That's a North American thing, dude.
So, Nick, as an Australian, part of the British Commonwealth, would you land as a convexityist as well, perhaps?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. Another one for the good guys.
I'll get Johnny Gentle on the case.
Oh, yeah. He'll do some work for sure. All right. Thanks again, Nick. Thanks for listening.
Ignored, it cuts to my core.